Good evening and welcome to our 12 Town Hall Courageous Conversations. I'm Shannon Heggie along with Eyewitness News reporter Courtney Carter. We've gathered members of our local Black community to talk about the national unrest in the wake of the death of George Floyd at the hands of police and the calls for change. And we want to welcome Jim Vincent, president of the NAACP Providence branch, Gary Dantzler, head of Black Lives Matter Rhode Island, Angela Ancoma, executive vice president for the United Way, and Jacqueline Peterson, special advisor to the president of Providence College. Thank you, all of you, for joining us tonight. Courtney?
Well, Jim, we'll start with you. You've been in your position for a number of years, and in your experience with the unrest we're seeing and how big the size of this movement is, do you think that this time things are different? And what do you think it is about the George Floyd case that makes it different?
I think things are different. I haven't seen this kind of unrest since the aftermath of the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968. And even then, I didn't see a worldwide protest like we see today. I think with the advent of media and cameras and whatever, everyone in the world was able to see George Floyd be murdered by a police officer. I don't think there was any ambiguity in anybody's minds around the world to what happened. So I think in other cases where there were Black lives that were taken, there's always been a sense of what happened before the video, what did he say? There's always been people that wanted to push back and to try to give the police the benefit of the doubt, even to an extreme. But in this case, it was clear to, I think, everybody what had happened. And it sparked something because of maybe the decades of unfairness, the institutional racism that has gone on, the conditions leading up to the pandemic, that people just said, enough is enough. We've had it. We're exacerbated. We just can't take it anymore. But the surprise is that it's worldwide now. I mean, people are marching worldwide. Racism is a worldwide disease, and people have had it. And maybe it took something so blatant.
Thank you, Jim. And you're right, we have seen these protests nationally as well as internationally in Paris and London. Thank you. Shannon?
Courtney, thank you. Angela, the next question for you. Unfortunately, so many of these peaceful protests have been overshadowed by violence and riots. Most recently, we saw it in Providence. How do you distinguish between looters and protesters, rioters and protesters? How important is it to make that distinction? And how do you make sure that the message isn't lost in that violence?
I think I'm no guru in terms of how you make sure messages don't get lost. I understand the anger in terms of people that, might want to riot because of the fact that they've been denied humanity since birth. Okay, racism is deep. And the indignities sometimes are on a daily basis. So the rage, I can understand that. All right. Martin Luther King said that riots are the voices of the unheard. And certainly these voices have not been heard because there's been no change for decades. So I can understand that. Okay. Now, in terms of the people that they call protesters, the peaceful protesters, I thought what happened this past Saturday was fantastic. You had over 1,000 people that rallied from Burnside Park to the State House saying that racism has to go. Institutional racism is a fact and we got to root it out, and people were of one accord. So it was beautiful. So, I think if I'm mad at anybody, I'm mad at the systems that create the anger in people.
Yeah.
The housing, health, the judicial system, all these systems are racist, okay, in this country. So it's created an anger. So if I'm going to be mad at anything, I'm going to be mad at the systems, not the people that are the victims of those systems.
Jim, thank you. Angela, I want to go to you. Can you talk about too that distinction between protests and looting? Because is it getting in the way of the message? Is it ruining what so many of these peaceful protests have done and the message they've got across so far?
I think that the focus should be on what the protests and the riots are a way of communicating people who have been unheard, as Jim has said, Martin Luther King said. I think people are choosing to do it in different ways, but I think instead of focusing on the behavior, we just need to focus on what are people trying to communicate. It's people who are so frustrated, who have not been empowered for generations upon generations, who have been tried, who've seen this over and over and over again, who have seen no results, no one's been held accountable, and they're frustrated, right? Is it the best way? Probably not. But we also have to think about how over and over and over again we've seen this happen, and we've seen what the outcome has been, right? And so I think it's just a different type of communication that people are choosing to do. So there are peaceful protests, there are looting, and there are violence. And so rather than focus exclusively on the violence, I really would like to focus on how do we understand, what are we trying to hear? What are the people trying to communicate?
Well, I guess that's my point, though. If people are using violence and using looting, does that make it difficult to focus on what the message is?
Oh, it does make it difficult, but we also want to hear, how do we understand where that violence is coming from?
Right.
Where is the source of that violence? So the violence is a symptom of something deeper, and that deeper thing is racism and having years and years and years of oppression and not being heard. So let's not focus on the symptom, which is the product of racism. Let's focus on that. And so yes, people are focusing on that, but I think it's on us to really think about what are the root causes of this violence.
Again, more about having that conversation and that understanding and continuing that dialogue. Angela, thank you. Courtney?
Gary, it's the Black Lives Matter movement, but we've seen a number of different races at these protests here in Rhode Island and across the country. What can white and non-white allies do to help?
Well, partial has to do with trust, right? You have to trust the community. You have to trust the community leaders. They must value their words. There's a whole system in place that been so suppressive for a long time, like Jim and everybody been saying. These things need to occur immediately to change some of these laws, because it's the same systemic problem that we really have, and that's the trust of the people. So it goes back to trust. A lot has to do with trust. So
thank you, Gary. That was a really interesting point. Shannon?
Jacqueline, you and I spoke yesterday about how you've lived all over the country. We see these protests, we mentioned in the beginning, they're happening all over the country, all over the world. Give us some insight. You've been here, you joined PC in 2018 as a consultant on diversity, but give us some insight on what you've seen here versus what you've seen in all areas of our country in regards to racism and police brutality.
Well, you're absolutely right, Shannon. I have lived many places in the country, and clearly the tensions exist in race relations throughout the country. And I think that it is just, the only difference is to what degree it manifests itself, to what degree it's pronounced. But, I was thinking about this the other morning here after all of this erupted, and I was thinking to myself, okay, I lived in California in 1991, right, with Rodney King, 1991. And I was in Florida during Trayvon Martin. And I have been in New York, and we know the various things that have happened in New York State over this period of time. So as progressive as some of the cities and states and so forth might be, at the same time, there remains this disproportionate, significant disparity among people of different races. And as was mentioned earlier, this is a systemic, infrastructural, organizational, institutional issue that spans our country. So I don't expect to see really that much difference in the fact that racism is there and it comes out and it rears its head. It just is a matter of the extent or how it does that.
Do you mean, just to clarify, it's more blatant in some places than in others?
I think so. I absolutely think so. I think, however, one of the things that I would say in terms of that is what really matters at the end of the day is the impact.
Right.
That's what really matters. And no matter how blatant, how subtle, whatever, it's the impact ends up being the same.
Right. And it's still there at the core. The issue remains, and obviously some kind of change needs to happen.
Right.
Jacqueline, thank you. Courtney?
Well, Jim, this is for you. And as Gary mentioned, what are some ways to break systemic racism right now? And what do you want non-Black people to know?
I want non-Black people to accept the fact that racism is as bad now as it's ever been. A lot of people, I think, that are not Black or who are white, they feel that things are much, much better than they ever have been before. And that's just not the case. And that institutional racism in Rhode Island, even in Rhode Island, is alive and well. I mean, we talk about the Providence Public Schools, 92% of color being one of the worst public school systems in the nation. We know that the home ownership gap between Black and white in Rhode Island is the furthest in the nation. And median income in terms of Black and white, the gap in Rhode Island is the third largest in the nation. So that just doesn't happen by accident or happenstance. That's institutional. You know, that's oppression of a people. That's not by accident. People are not being heard. People are not being valued. They're not being accepted. You know, I don't care if you call it nepotism or cronyism. I call it racism in terms of employment. You know, the housing situation where people, you know, even with good credit can't get a loan. I mean, you have that in small business with that owner with good credit can't get a loan because of the color of their skin. That exists today. That's not something we're talking about 40, 50 years ago, which it did exist then, but it exists today. Okay, so I think I would tell them, look, don't relax. We need you as allies. There are people that we have in the white community that are allies. There's a lot of people like that. We need them to talk to their family and their friends that might not be as enlightened as them, because only they are going to be able to effectively reach them. They may listen to me and they might say, okay, Jim, I'm with you, I like that. But I don't think I really reached them, you know, not like the way their family member could reach them or their friend, a good friend could reach them. We need them to each one reach 10. There's a saying, each one reach one. Each one of our allies in the white community, you reach 10. You do that effectively, and I think maybe we'll start seeing some change.
So Jim, correct me if I'm wrong. So basically you're saying that communication, saying that these inequalities still exist, like the housing inequalities in the school districts, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people don't realize that. I mean, they're so busy in their lives, and they should be, trying to put food on the table, they work or whatever. I mean, how many people actually know, even in the Black community, that in terms of the home ownership rate, the biggest difference between Black and white home ownership in the country, the biggest gap, is in Rhode Island. Black people are only half as likely to own their homes as the white community. There's no other state where the gap is that big in the country. Who knows that? So we have to educate, we have to think. I've been saying it for years, but you got to have a lot of people saying it. Median incomes, you know, the average white, I think median income in Rhode Island is 60,000. The average median income for Blacks is 30,000, something like that. How can you live on 30,000? And certainly people are as qualified, as talented, as able as anybody else. They just don't have the opportunity. And, you know, no matter what you say, the biggest factor is the color of their skin, more than anything. And that's what it is. And we have to accept that. It's painful, it's hard. Nobody's here to point the finger or to gotcha, you know, because that's not going to work. You got to do it in a way that people will accept it. I'm trying to embrace people. I'm not trying to say, you know, point the finger and blame. That's not, I don't think, going to be effective. So you have to have the right tactics, but I think you have to win the hearts and souls of white people before you're ever going to get effective change.
Thank you, Jim. So education, communication, and more opportunity. Shannon?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Angela, you're a mom of 4, 2 of them boys. Shed some light on the talk when it comes to police brutality for people who don't know what that is.
Wow. The talk. Really, the talk consists of really, you know, kids learn at an early age that they're different. just by nature, they notice differences. As early as 6 months, actually, the last researchers heard kids learn that difference. And by 2 to 3 years, they formulated differences between races, not racists. But also, when you notice those races, they also notice that they're being treated differently. So I actually had that talk with my son really early at 3 years old when he was being treated differently in his preschool, sadly. And it was a talk that was really difficult for him. At 3 years old, it was a talk that was hard to have with a 3-year-old who didn't really understand why he had to leave his daycare. But we know the school to prison pipeline starts as early as preschool, and it was starting for my son. So I had to have those tough and courageous conversation with my son as early as 3 years old. And so it's not a conversation. So he's had that conversation since he was 3 years old, and it's a conversation that I continue to have with him, and know that, while he may have friends who are of different races and different backgrounds, that he is not going to be treated the same. He experienced that. And that he has to be mindful. Now that he's 12 years old, I need to be mindful of him about where he goes and his spaces, and being mindful and being alert. I haven't had the chance because he's always with me or with somebody, a trusted adult. But I haven't yet have to have the conversation of what him to do with him when he encounters a police officer or somebody else of authority. I do know that he's had many interactions with police officers in Rhode Island, positive officers, because some of our friends are actually on a local force here. And so I'm happy that he's had some favorable interactions with them. But I also know that they may not always be that way. So I need to make sure that he knows what to do if he's, Tamar Rice was 12 years old. I just looked that up. I forgot he was 12. My son is 12. And so I need to have that conversation with him. When he's playing or what space he's at, he needs to be mindful of that. And so as early as 3 years old, I've had that conversation with my son. And so it's not new for him.
But when it comes down to it, there's a different conversation for someone like me with my sons, and just talking about respecting police and teaching them about authority versus, and we've heard this, and these videos have come up. Courtney shared one with me over the weekend of a different conversation of things a young black man was sharing that he was told of, don't wear this, don't put your music too loud. Can you speak to that a bit as well?
Oh yeah, like his hair, his clothes, what type of clothes he can wear, the spaces he should be in, at what times of the day, which neighborhoods he should be in. I'm very mindful of, you can't be, he has friends all over the state. And so his friends in Kingston, I make sure that he's mindful. He's going out with them, make sure that they're inside at a certain time of the day, or if they're with their adults. And so these are conversations, I have with him all the time.
Does that come from a level of fear?
Does that come from absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it shouldn't.
And protection.
Yeah. Angela, thank you. Courtney?
Gary, this is for you. When do you think the protesting and, on the other side, the looting will stop? And why do you think it's continuing?
I think there's a lack of trust. Again, it goes back to the system itself, period. There's a history, like Jim was saying. You got to remember, people, there's two lenses behind it, right? You have the white American side, and you have the black American side. So right from the start, we know what's been going on throughout the years, and like Jim said, decades of oppression. Right now is so critical because I don't know when it's going to stop. I really don't believe it will stop. I think that, we need aid fast. We need education fast. We need, a whole black hub to understand we have a lot of catching up to do. I mean, extremely a lot, from the education factor, from having race relations and all around the country. And that doesn't mean we need like strict laws changed. I mean, we let a lot of things go. I mean, far as, white Americans, they was very passive, and not being, not being respectful throughout the history of time of, we have to deal with these type of issues in our community. And it's heart wrenching sometimes to, to even ask for anything in our community, So I don't see a change for a while, I really don't. It's overwhelming to be black as a black man in America, to be overlooked, to be invincible, my family to be invincible, my kids, my mother, my father, my sister, my brother. The same stories has resonated all around the country. So.
We're still waiting for our 40 acres and a mule, huh, Brother Gary?
What was that?
We're still waiting for our 40 acres and a mule.
You just said it. You just said it. And I think one day we might get a little bit, and we can make something out of it. But one of the things is that we're looking really steady is having race relations. We have to have this conversation. It's uncomfortable, but we need to have an action plan. We need to understand about white supremacy. White supremacy is really taking over our country, and it's showing as the demonstrations get larger and larger across America. And a lot of white Americans, they don't want to be involved. They want to help out. They don't want to be called racist. They don't want to be labeled as a racist. So they really want to help out. That's why you see so many protesters involved. And, there's two sides of the story, but we see a lot of white, protesters and get involved. And a lot of them they're doing the right, and they're doing all the destructions in some communities. And sometimes we're like, wait a minute, that's a white guy or a white woman. And it's like, wait a minute, what are they doing? They destroying their cities and making it look like the minorities are doing it. So it's a catch-22 with that too. So unfortunately.
So Gary, can I actually go back for a second? And somebody else actually jumped in on the town hall as well. Can you explain to viewers what 40 acres and a mule is, for those that don't know?
I think Jim should answer that one.
Thanks, Gary.
He can give a little history a little better than me. I'm the student.
Well, the slaves, after they were freed, they were promised 40 acres and a mule. We never got that. That was something that would have, I guess, been the right thing to do, and that was decided to do at the end of, I guess, Civil War. We never got our 40 acres and a mule, so you have people that still talk about, where's our 40 acres and a mule? We're like about 160 years later. But, to me, one of the biggest problems is that racism sells. I mean, to keep the working class, the poor at each other,
yes.
Somebody's benefiting. And what they try to do, I think, to benefit them and their class is to keep the division, keep the hatred, to keep the racism. Because as long as that's happening, then they'll continue to benefit and there'll be no problem. So this is very systemic at a very high level. And it's always been in this country. Certain people have benefited, and the vast majority of people, black and white, have not.
Right.
Well, this country has always benefited on black bodies financially.
Absolutely. Free labor. We built this country for free. I mean, so you can't, that's a pretty good deal.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Jacqueline, I'm sorry to interrupt. Jacqueline, I want to go back to something that Gary said about all of this being overwhelming. And you look at how far we go back here to March. And first you had the COVID-19 crisis and how it was disproportionately affecting the black community. And then you have Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. And then you have George Floyd. And what is your advice to the black community, to people dealing with this, to keep their heads above water? Because, as Gary said, it's overwhelming. How are you dealing with it personally?
Well, one of the things that I wanted to go back to what Brother Gary said, when you ask him the question about, is it going to change? What's going to bring about the change? And, I think, and this answers your question as well, Shannon, is that there is a resilience. There is just this unbelievable resilience that black people have. And I think that resilience and that perseverance has been a game changer. And I believe that the progress of the movement of what we're seeing that we have made has come as a result of that resilience And now we're beginning to see, and as Brother Gary suggested, people joining in who are folks who are majority people, who are the younger student activists, the folks who are trying to be educated, have been educated, and saying, they're joining their voices in with saying enough is enough. And that would not have happened with just sitting by and letting things and waiting for change. It comes from that stick-to-itiveness, that strength that we have had for generations. And I think that is one of the things that makes this particular moment in time and what we have seen in the last several weeks, months, days, a watershed moment. Because when you look out there and you look at the protesters, those who are protesting peacefully, as opposed to the educators or the agitators who were, infiltrating to basically wreak havoc and harm. You look at the makeup of those folks out there, it's a diverse makeup. I think that folks have finally, had this wake-up call and said, okay, when, as Martin Luther King says, what affects one affects, in a way, affects us all.
Yeah.
Indirectly.
And I think that's something, to your point, that personally I've seen, and I know Jim mentioned this about the video, how there's no ambiguity. The video that we all saw leaves nothing to the imagination. And I've heard a lot of people say, I'm awake now and I'm done sitting back and I'm done being silent. And so to your point, it seems like there is more action right now, and we can only hope that it does lead to actual change. Courtney?
Jim, what do you want to see from government and state leaders?
That to me?
Yes, it's to you.
Oh, well, first of all, I want to make sure that they're listening, that they hear our voices. Black Lives Matter, Black voices need to be heard. And I think in Rhode Island, pretty much the leaders, the governor, the congressional delegation, the police commissioner, and attorney general, et cetera, they are listening. They are open to listening. So I think we're fortunate here in Rhode Island, more than most places. It's not perfect, but I think we're a little more fortunate here. I feel that way. So I think that they're open to our suggestions in ways now that maybe they wouldn't have been before, because it's all political calculation. It's all, got to weigh the politics of it. But I think it's swinging the other way, because I think for the first time, now you have a generation of young white Americans that feel the same kind of hopelessness that Black people have felt forever.
Yes.
All right. First time they don't feel that they're going to do better than their parents. This is the first generation of young people in general, but especially white people, that are not going to do as well as their parents, and they're angry. And unlike their parents, who, when they were told it's the Black person that's the problem, your problem, these young people are not buying that. It's a different world. They've grown up around Black people. They don't see us as the demons as much because of the technology and all of that. I'm not saying that all of them are like that, but a lot of them are saying, no, they ain't the problem. There's a problem, but it ain't them. And I'm angry and I'm hopeless. I'm going to join with them because, I think where they're going is where I need to go. So that's when you see the integration with the young people. But I think even older people are now accepting the fact that racism exists. It's hard for them to accept it. They don't want to believe that in America, USA, that we still have racism. Who wants to believe that? Who wants to accept that? They're living lives that are unfettered by being followed around in stores and can't get a taxi cab. So they can't imagine that there are Black people that are as old as me that exhibit or go through racism every day. They can't, and it is hard. If I was white, I guess I wouldn't believe it either. It's unfathomable that in America, that a person that, is as old as me has gone through indignities almost daily. It doesn't seem possible, but it is. And I think now they're believing it. They see it. It's undeniable. And it's like, the first reaction is like sadness, because, wow, America's like this. Now they're saying, what can I do? I've had so many people call me, what can I do? I mean, dozens. So if there's any silver lining in any of this, it's that it's woken up a lot of people that weren't woke. I'm talking about in the white community primarily. And I think so I'm optimistic. I'm always optimistic. The day I don't become optimistic is the day I give this up. This is a lifetime thing for me. I've been doing it almost 50 years. So I'm still hopeful.
Yep.
So it sounds like from what you're saying, this generation is leading the change. And like Shannon said, people have cell phones. They're seeing it. Things are being recorded. They're seeing these videos. They're being shared on social media. So they're awake and seeing these things.
Yep.
Thank you, Jim.
And
Shannon?
I was going to say there's another characteristic, I think, of the current generation, and that is accountability. And I think that there's a real, wherever that has come from, there is this real passion and expectation and attitude of holding those before them accountable for their actions. And I think, that is something that inspires me as we continue to educate young activists and make sure that they are absolutely have the tools, the educational, the historical evidence, the information, the tools that they need in their wheelhouse to really go out there and critically think and strategize on how to make things change, how to make a difference, how to be responsible, and at the same time, hold others accountable, hold our leaders accountable.
Jacqueline, thank you. Speaking of leaders, Angela, we talked about local and government leaders here. If you could meet President Trump, what would you tell him about Black America and other ethnic groups?
Ooh. If I could meet President Trump, wow. I'm not sure, and I'm going to be completely honest, I'm not sure if it's worth a meeting.
You feel he's that disconnected from the entire message that you're trying to get across?
Yeah, I haven't felt, it's been 3.5 years. We've given it 3.5 years. And I'm not convinced that anything is going to be accomplished in a meaningful way.
What about mainstream America, those who don't get it, those who still aren't processing this? We talk about young people, maybe this generation, they get it. What about the older generation? What is the disconnect there?
I think, and I've been saying recently, that there's a huge disconnect because I don't think that we have the full picture. And we have to understand this in a historical context. We've gotten the half of the American history, not the full American history. Because if you think that the George Floyd incident is just one incident of many ways in which this country has wronged African Americans. And I think when you're just open, when you think about African Americans only in the context of Black History Month, then yeah, you think, oh, this is just one incident, but you have to look at everything from 1619 and even before, because there were Africans before 1619 in the United States, in the Americas. And so I think knowing the historical context, I think people really taking a moment to self-reflect, that's important. To think, part of that racial identity development. I think people don't understand that whites also have to do some racial identity development as well too. There are some people who don't even think that they see. I still hear in 2020, I see no color, right?
Right.
And so there's still a lot of white racial identity development that still needs to happen in this country. Or I treat people, or just because you treat somebody kind, that means that that's justice, right? Dr. Martin Luther King says kindness does not equal justice. So we have to think about all these things, be reflective of, if you see a Black man in the elevator and it gives you a moment to pause, what does that mean? Really do that gut check with yourself and your family members, because then you realize that maybe there is something I need to do with myself and my children. And I think we need to not shy away from these conversations about race until these moments. We need to be having conversations about race as early as we can. Because when you start having these conversations about race, when you're adults, people are already too uncomfortable. When you mention racial identity, when you just mention race, people, I can tell the temperature of the room changes every single time you mention it. right?
Right.
We can't be uncomfortable about race. At 6 months old, babies understand what race is. At 3 years old, babies and children see the differences. So why not talk about it, right?
Right.
Having open and honest conversations from the youngest age will help us, and not waiting till people are adults. You know, we have adults who are so uncomfortable talking simply about race. We need to stop.
And I think that's exactly why we did this tonight. And I want to again thank all of you for joining us. Jacqueline, Angela, Jim, and Gary, thank you so much for being with us, for having this honest conversation. Let's keep these conversations going. For Eyewitness News, WPRI 12, I'm Shannon Heggie, along with Courtney Carter.